So yesterday we were discussing some Agadata, which we're going to continue today, very briefly before we go back to the halachic discussions. We were talking about why HaKadosh Baruch Hu exiled the Jewish people specifically to Bavel over all other lands. We had seen two explanations. One is because this was the land of our Mama Medina. This was the place where Avraham Avinu got his start. So when Hashem sends us away, He sends us back to the house of our mother. Basically, that's the idea. Another explanation is because the language of Aramaic, of Bavel, is very similar to Lashon HaKodesh. That was the second reason. Now we're going to see a third reason, which is very almost amusing. Ula Omar Kedei Shiochlu Tamarim V'Yasku B'Torah. Ula says that, and this is the starting with the bottom line of Pei Zayin and Beis, going to the top of Pei Ches, that it's in order that there should be dates available to eat so that we could study Torah in Bavel. In other words, God placed us in an economically flourishing area, fertile crescent, where their produce was in abundance, so that we could eat Torah without the bother or without the concern of economic pressures. We'll have plenty of food, plenty of dates in our baskets, and we'll be able to study Torah. Ula ikla la Pumpadisa krivole turina de Tamari. Ula once came to the city of Pumpadisa, and they brought him out a basket of dates. Amar lahu kama kihani bezuza. He says, how many baskets can I get for a zuz? So Amrulay Tlas Bezuzah. They said you can get three whole baskets of dates for just one zuz. Amar Malot Sana de Dubsha Bezuzah. Ubavloy Lo Aski Bioraisa. He says with tremendous criticism. He says, oh my goodness, he says, you can get opulence here. You can get a whole basket of honey for a zuz. And the Babylonians still don't study that much Torah. In other words, he was being critical. You have all of this wealth at your feet, and you're still not studying Torah. So Belelia...
Babylonians or the Jews living in Babylon?
Jews. Well, of course he's talking about Jews. I mean, what Babylonian Gentiles? What are they talking about Babylonian? Why would they be studying Torah? Talking about Jewish Babylonians. Belelia tzi aruhu. So at night, he got intestinal problems from eating all those dates. So it's probably a laxative, right? Yeah. So Amar... Then he said with tremendous admiration, he says, how is it that they pay a zuz for a basket full of poison, and yet they still study Torah despite all of their invariable intestinal problems? They still have time to study Torah. So in other words, this was the reversal of Ula's opinion. Dates are great, but if a diet that is purely dates does not bode well. Probably not good for diabetics either. Anyway, va'amar Rebbe Lazar, my dichsiv v'halchu amim rabim va'amar luchu v'nal el har Hashem el beis elokei Yaakov v'gomer. Now, this Agadat is being brought in the context of Rebbe Lazar being the author of many of the statements previously. He also said, in the same idea about the exiles and the returning of the exiles, that all of the nations will come, and they will say, let us go up to the mount of God, to the house of the Lord of Jacob. Right? So the Gemara asks the question, Elokei Yaakov, Elokei Avram v'Yitzchak. Why is he only called the God of Jacob and not the God of Avram and Yitzchak? So Elokei Avram shekasav bohar, Shenamar asher yeomer hayom bahar Hashem yira'eh. The answer is that Avram and Yitzchak had a shortcoming that Yaakov Avinu did not have. When Avram sees the place of the Har Habayis, which is on Har HaMoriah, where he does the Akedah, he calls it Hashem Yir'eh, right? God will see. But he calls it the mountain where God will see. He doesn't call it the house where God will see. And v'lo b'yiki Yitzchak shekasav bo sadeh, shenemar vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. Nor like Yitzchak, who saw the same place and called it a field, as it says that Yitzchak went out to pray in the field. But rather, Eloki Yaakov shekra'o bayis. But only like Yaakov, who had the vision to be able to look out at a flat land or a mound of earth, and to be able to truly envision the house of God built upon it. Shenamar vayikra shem hamakom ahu beis el, that Yaakov calls this place the house of the Lord. And so that basically tells you that he who is able to fulfill the idea of vision, in order to be a visionary, Hashem gives you credit if you're able to visualize a glorious future in very visceral, concrete terms. Hashem rewards you with the eventuality of that vision being called by your name.
Did Yaakov do anything, or he was just giving him the nevuah by Hashem. And Hashem is the one who gave it to him, right? That nevuah.
No, Yaakov coined the term Baysel. He called it Baysel. He just had a dream about angels going up and down a ladder, but he said, this is the place where the house of Hashem will be. He was able to actually concretize the dream into a house, into a dwelling place for the Shekhinah. So obviously there's much more depth here, but that's the basic idea. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Gadol Kibbutz Golios Kiyom Shenivru Bo Shemayim Va'aretz. Rabbi Yochanan says the day of the ingathering of the exiles is as great as the day of creation of heaven and earth. And where do you see this in Scripture? Shenamar V'nikbetzu B'nei Yehuda V'nei Yisrael Yachdav V'samu Lahem Rosh Echad V'alu Min Haaretz Ki Gadol Yom Yisrael. So the pasuk that talks about Kibbutz Golios talks about all of the tribes of Yehuda and Yisrael gathering together, placing one head over themselves, the Mashiach, and they will come up from the earth or from the land, because great is the day of Yisrael. Rashi says the operative word here is the word Yom. And Uchasiv Vayira Vayivoker Yom Echad, and it also says by creation Yom, day one. So you see that the idea of a day is an allusion to creation. So this day of Kibbutz Golios would be like the day of creation, where the world will be recreated in a sense. Okay, let's go back to the halachic discussion. We saw that if a woman is in her first year and she's going back and forth from her father's house to her husband's house, she can eat the Korban Pesach with whomever she chooses. And the Gemara asked the question over there, well, do you see there Yesh Breiris? The Gemara says, no, not necessarily there's retroactivity, but she makes her decision, makes up her mind before the Shechita. We're going to have a similar question by the Yasam, by the orphan. Yasam Sheshachtu Lavat Petropsim, B'chulei, that if we have two custodians that are overseeing the estate of the Yasam, then the Yasam, who is a minor, I think someone asked, was it Alan who asked me that question yesterday? Is he a minor? Yeah, we'll see. He is a minor. The minor can decide whichever house he's going to be eating by. So the Gemara says, Shamas Mina Yesh Breira. Here too, it would seem that there's Breira, because the child is deciding retroactively if the Shechita of this guy of Reuven was for him or the Shechita of Shimon was for him. So Amar Rab Zeira Sel Aboyas Mikol Makom. No, the Gemara says, and notice that this is a different answer. Really, the Yasam is able to decide after the Shechita, but the truth of the matter is that it's got nothing to do with his decision. Because he is a minor, as we'll see in just a second, his thinking process is not taken into account as far as the being counted as far as the chabura. As long as his custodian has certain custodial rights over this child, the child is considered to be part of both households of both custodians. And as long as the head of the household shechts the Korban Pesach for his whole household, then everyone is considered to be part of that household, as long as they're minors, as we'll see them some qualifications. But as long as it's a child, the child automatically is counted in, whether he had das or not, to be part of that chabura. Tana Rabban, and let's see this elaborated upon. The Brisa says, Sel aboyis, malamed sha'adam mevi v'shochet al yidei beno uvito haktanim, v'al yidei avdo v'shivchaso hakenanim. Bein midaitan, bein shalom midaitan. This pasuk of Sel aboyis, that one sheep per household, tells me that as long as the head of the household has everyone in his household in mind, then he can shecht for the members of his household, and this includes minor children, and it includes his avadim, his Canaanite slaves, whether they consent or whether they don't consent. In other words, even if they don't consent, even if they expressly say, I don't want to be part of the chabura, the Korban Pesach is shechted for them because their volition is not required. Okay, aval eno shochet al yedei beno uvito hagdolim v'ydei avdo v'shivchaso ha'ivrim v'ydei ishto ela midaitan. However, when it comes to the adults and the halachically full-fledged Jews of his household, meaning his adult children, his Hebrew slaves, and his wife, they have to give their consent in order to be counted as part of the chabur. They have to be notified and acknowledge that they're part of the chabur in order for the shechita to work for them. Tanya Idach, we have another brisa which says, Lo yishchod adam lo al yedei beno vito hagdolim v'ydei avdo v'shivchaso ha'ivrim v'ydei ishto ela midaiton. This brisa says the same idea, that a man may not shech the Korban Pesach for his adult children, for his Hebrew slaves, or for his wife, unless he gets their consent. Aval sholchid hu al yedei beno vito haktanim v'ydei avdo v'shivchaso haktanim bein midaiton uvein shelo midaiton. But he can shecht for his minor children, for his Canaanite slaves, whether they acknowledge it or whether they give their approval or not. The kulan sheshachtu v'shachat rabban aleihem, and the last part of this brisa says that in a scenario where the head of the household shechts, and let's say a member of the household shechts independently his own carbon pesach, yotzen b'shel rabban vein yotzen b'shel atzman, chutz min ha'isha sheyachol limchos. In all situations, the members of the household are considered to be per force counted in the carbon pesach of the head of the household, and therefore they cannot partake of their own carbon pesach because it's invalid, because the head of the household already shechted the carbon pesach for them, except for a woman, except for the wife. The wife has the right to say, no, I reserve the right to shech my own carbon pesach. So the Gemara says, Maishna Isha. Why are you singling out the wife? Meaning that we saw that not only is it the wife, but it's adult children and Hebrew slaves, which are also part of this category, who have the right to basically withdraw from the household carbon pesach. So why are you only singling out the wife? The Gemara says, Amar Rava Isha v'chol dedamila. Rava says, you're right. It's not just the wife who has the right to withdraw from the household carbon pesach, but the wife, the Hebrew slaves, and the adult children, if they want to, they can shech their own carbon pesach and basically say, I'm not going to partake of the household carbon pesach. So the Gemara says, but you really have an inherent contradiction if so. Haguf akasha, amart chutz min ha'isha sheyachol limchos, taima demachi halamachi nafka b'shel baila. So because the first part of the brisa had said that the last part of the brisa, I should say, that they cannot be yotzei with their own carbon pesach except for the wife who has a right to protest. So essentially that implies that only when she protests does she not count as part of the carbon pesach. But if she doesn't protest, we assume that her silence is tacit approval that she wants to be counted with her husband's carbon pesach. Frek the Gemara v'hakatani reisha v'lo yedei ishto ela midaitan. But the first part of the brisa had said that you can only shech the carbon pesach if you get the wife's consent. And then only then does it count for her. Hastama lo nafka, which implies that without her express approval, her silence is insufficient. You have to get her proactive express approval of I consent before she can be counted as part of the husband's carbon pesach. So what is silence? From the Reish, it sounds like silence is insufficient. From the Seif, it's mashma that silence is tacit approval. So the Gemara says, no, my elamidaitan lavda amri in. So the Gemara says, doesn't the word midaitan mean that they expressly verbalize, yes, I want to be part of the chabura? The Gemara says, no, ela bistama. Lafo kehecha da amar lo. No, really it means, and I think, by the way, I think you may have to change the word ella to lo. It makes more sense to change that girsa from ella to lo. Lo, bistama. No, it means that they don't say anything. In other words, when the first part of the brisa says you need to get their approval, it doesn't mean you need to get their verbal, proactive approval, but rather you need just them to remain silent. And silence is a tacit approval. And lafu kehecha d'amar lo, to the exclusion of where they actively, expressly say, I don't want to be part of the chabura. And therefore, shtika koda. And therefore, it's not a stira. Both the Reish and the Seifa are implying that when a woman is silent, she means to be counted as part of her husband's chabura. Frek the Gemara v'hakulam sheshachtu v'shachat rabban aleim yotzen b'shel rabbam dibistama v'katani chutz min ha'ish mipnei sheyachol limchas. But 1 second, says the Gemara, what about the case where it says that if the head of the household, the husband shechts the carbon pesach, and the woman shechts, the wife shechts her own carbon pesach, even if she didn't say anything expressly, she's allowed to use her own carbon pesach. So you see that even her silence doesn't count. It does not count as a tacit approval. You see from that last case that just as long as she shechts the carbon pesach without saying anything, that's considered to be a dissent. So the Gemara says, Amarava kevin sheshachta ein lecha michoy gadol mizah. The Gemara says actions speak louder than words. If she's silent and she doesn't do anything, that's tacit approval that she wants to be part of her husband's carbon pesach. But if she's silent and she shechts her own carbon pesach, there's no greater indication that she's withdrawing from her husband's carbon pesach. That's even more powerful than her saying she doesn't want to be part of it. Okay, so that's the conclusion of the Gemara.
Is there a stam das isha kagufo? Like just in these kind of things?
Is there an assumption? Yeah. Well, I think that's a valid point. There's an assumption, that if the husband is going to do something on behalf of his household, his wife usually wants to be included. However, the only reason why a woman has a right to withdraw, and that's, by the way, that's the halacha when it comes to marital arrangements. The husband is obligated to provide mazonos for his wife, and he also has a right to demand that the wife be responsible for household chores. And yet the Gemara says in Kedushin that a woman has a right to say, Eini nizones ve'eini osa. I don't need your food. I'm going to go out and get myself a job. I'm a career woman. I'm going to go out and get a job. Don't bring home food for me. You can fend for yourself, and I'll fend for myself. A woman has the right to do that, but she has to say that expressly. If she remains silent, the assumption is that she's a dependent on her husband for food, and the husband has a right to demand the domestic responsibilities of his wife. It's pretty much the same idea. Okay. Rami law, so now the next piece of Mishnah was Evet shel shnei shutvin b'chulei. A slave that is shared by two partners. The halacha is that the Evet cannot partake of the Korban Pesach of either master, of neither Ruvain or Shimon, because we assume that Ruvain doesn't want to feed the part of the Evet that is owned by Shimon, and similarly Shimon doesn't want to feed the part of the Evet that's owned by Ruvain. So Rami le Rav Eina Saba Rav Nachman. Rav Eina Saba. Now Eina Saba is a very interesting name. It means the wizened eye, or the aged eye, which is probably, I don't know if that was his real name, but it was probably an appellation to show that he was a man of great discernment because of his wisdom in old age. So, but I guess that's the name that he went by. So he asked Rav Nachman the following contradiction: Tanan Evet shel shnei shutvin lo yachal mishel shneihem. We saw in our Mishnah that the Evet cannot eat by either master. Ai v'hatanya ratzim izah ochel, ratzim izah ochel. But the Brisa says that he has a right to eat by either one. What are you talking about? So Amarlei Eina Saba. So Rav Nachman said back to him, good. It's good that your name is Eina Saba, because you are a wizened, discerning eye. And va'amri la patyu uchma. Some say that he called him you sooty pot. And what he means by that is when you call someone a sooty pot, what you really mean to say is that you've been around the block many times. Obviously, you have a lot of experience in your Torah study, just like a pot that is very sooty at the bottom has the symptoms of being used many times. It means it's a good pot. You love to use it, right? So anyway, I don't know if I'd want to be called a sooty pot, but if you called it to me, I wouldn't take it as an insult. Anyway, mini uminach, just don't call me late for breakfast. Mini uminach tistayim shmaitza. So he says that from your kasha and from my teretz we'll be able to figure everything out. He says, Masnisin b'dekapti yahadadi, brisa lo kapti yahadadi. He says shkoyach to him for showing me this brisa, because basically you've demonstrated that it depends. When the two partners, Reuven and Shimon and the slave, are makbid on each other, which means that they're very careful, very punctilious not to share assets, that's when the Evet cannot eat by either one, because either one begrudges the other of having to take care of the other person's portion in the Evet. The Brisa, which says that the Evet could go to either one he wants, is where there's a certain friendliness between the two partners, and there's a mechila. They're moichel each other. Like, let's say, if you use the Evet a little bit more than I use him, or you have to, or I use him more than you use him, we're each moichel on each other, and therefore it's okay. I don't mind if he comes to eat by me, and I'll feed your chelik. And the same thing, you feel the same way, and that's why the Evet has the right in the Brisa to go eat by whichever one he wants. Next, Misha Chetzio Evet v'Chetzio ben Charin lo yochal Mishal Rabo. The Mishnah had also said finally that if a person is half slave and half free, which basically he was originally owned by two masters, and then what happened is that one of the masters frees him so that he's half free and half a slave. And the halacha is that one day he works for himself and the other day he works for his master. So in that situation, he's not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach by his master, again, because we assume the master is going to be begrudging and not going to want to feed the part of him that is owned by himself. Mishal Rabahu de lo yoichal avol mishal atzmo yoichal. So it sounds like from this Mishnah that he's just not allowed to eat the Korban Pesach of his master, but he can eat his own Korban Pesach. But the Gemara says, wait a minute, v'hatanya lo yochal lo mishal v'lo mishal Rabba. But the Brisa says he can't eat his own Korban Pesach nor his master's Korban Pesach. So the Gemara says, Lo kasha, kan kamishna rishona, kan kamishna acharona. There's no contradiction. There's two different periods in history where the halacha evolved, the halacha changed. That originally someone who was half slave and half free man could remain in that status, and therefore the problem is he can't eat his own Korban Pesach because the part of him that's a slave is subjugated to his master's table, and therefore cannot be counted to anyone's table except his master. The part of him that's the free man cannot be counted at his master's table, but can only be part of his own table. So he really can't eat at his table or at his master's table. But our Mishnah seems to say that he could be counted as part of his own table. Why? And as we'll see in just a moment, because even though currently he's still half slave, half free, but Chazal assign him the status as totally free in anticipation of him being emancipated very soon. If someone is half slave, half free, so Basil is of the opinion he works for himself a day and he works for his master a day, alternating days. Beishamai says you've made a very nice provision for his master to be able to share him 50% of the time. But you haven't made a provision for this guy to have any semblance of a real life, because Lisa Shivcha ina yachol shekvar chetzio ben chorin, Lisa bas chorin ina yachol shedain chetzio evet, yibata v'alo niver elam elo leprio revia shnemer lo tobero elo sheves yitzara. So Beis Shammai says, I don't understand. You're not letting this guy have any domestic life. He can't marry a shivcha because half of him is a free man, and a free man can't marry a shivcha. He can't marry a Jewish woman because half of him is a Canaanite slave, so he can't. That part of him can't marry. So what's he going to do? He's going to be a confirmed bachelor. The Torah doesn't want that. The Torah says that the Hashem didn't create the world for naught. He created it for procreation. How's this guy supposed to procreate and build a family? So Elam ibnei tikana olam kofinas rabo v'oso so ben chorin because of Sharl Chatzi Damav. That rather, what has to be done in order to rectify the world? In other words, in order to make a provision for this guy, we force the master to free him. And basically, the master, the guy who owns half of him, is entitled to compensation for that. So even if this chatzi eved, this half free, half slave, doesn't have the money, he presents it to him in a promissory note that he owes him the money for his emancipation, and then the guy becomes a free man, and then he can move on with his life. V'chazu Basil laharos ke Beis Shammai, and Basil finally assented, and they agreed that Beis Shammai, you make a lot of sense. We got to do something for this poor guy. And so, based on that, that's why our Mishnah says that he's allowed to partake in his own Korban Pesach, because even though he hasn't yet been emancipated, but his emancipation is imminent, and therefore we view him as his own person. Let's go weiter. Mishnah says, Ha'omer la'avdot, tzei shchot alayas ha'pesach. A guy says to his slave, go ahead and shecht the Korban Pesach for me. He doesn't give any specifications. He says, go to my friend, the farmer or the shepherd, go get an animal from him, shecht the Korban Pesach, you're my shaliach. So shachat gedi yoichal, shachat le yoichal. Since the master didn't specify, regardless of whether the eved goes ahead and shechts a goat or a lamb, either one is kosher, and the balabayas has to take whatever the guy brings home, even if he's normally used to eating a different animal. Shachat gedi utle yochal min arishon. If the eved is not sure and he shechts both animals, so you have to take the first one that he shechts. That's the one that's designated for the Korban Pesach. The Gemara will clarify. Shachach ma omer lo rabo ketzad yaseh. Now, what if the master had designated and said, "Look, I don't like lamb. I only like goat, or I don't like goat. I only like lamb, and I want you to do one." And he tells him which animal to use. And the eved forgets. By the time he's an absent-minded eved. By the time he gets to the shepherd, he doesn't remember what his master told him. So what should he do? Yishcho tle ugedi v'yomer im gedi omer li Rabbi gedi shalo tle shali v'im tle omer li Rabbi hatle shalo gedi shali. So he says basically like this. He says if my master told me a goat, so then the goat that I am shechting shall be for my master, and the sheep shall be for me. Shall be my Korban Pesach. And if, which seems a little bit strange, seems to contradict our previous Mishnah, which says that Eved Kanani is basically a dependent exclusively on his master. So the world will have to clarify this. And then he says, and if my master wanted a sheep or a lamb, then that'll be for my master, and the goat will be for me. Shachach Rabo Ma'armalo. Now let's say the Eved makes that tonight because he forgot, and he brings back home both animals, and then the master also forgot. Gee, I forgot what I told you to do. I don't remember. So now they really got saras. So therefore, Shneim Yetzu Lebeis Hasreifa Upitern Milasos Pesach Sheni. Both animals have to be incinerated because we don't know which one is the real Korban Pesach. But they're pater from doing a Pesach Sheni because since one of them surely was the Korban Pesach, they were Yotze. They just can't eat it since one of them has to be burned and the other one has to be eaten, and we don't know which one it is. So we're not allowed to eat the one that's meant to be burnt. Because the halacha is that a Mosar Pesach, that a leftover Korban Pesach has to be burnt. You're not allowed to eat it. So therefore you have to burn both of them. and they were Yotzei, both Yotzei Pesach, the Korban Pesach, even though they didn't eat it, and they don't bring a Pesach Sheni. So now the Gemara says, Pshita, Shachat Gedi, Yoichal Afal Gav Derogel Betleh, Shachat Lo Yoichal Afal Gav Derogel Begedi. So it seems quite evident from the Mishnah that even if the master is normally used to a goat, and the Eved shechts for him a sheep or vice versa, he's still Yotzei the Korban Pesach. Since he didn't specify, we assume that he's okay with whatever the Eved brings home. But Ela Shachat Gediu Tle Yochel Min Arishon. But what's the next part? The next part you said was that if the Eved brings home because he doesn't know what the master wants, and so to cover all his bases, he shechts both a Gedi and a Tle. So we only use the first one that was shechted. So why is that? But don't we learn that you have to find out which chabur you're going to be a part of. You can't just sort of hedge your bets, right? And so why is it that he's considered to be part of the first animal? If a man is going to have two animals shechted for him, we should really have to consult with him to find out which one he wants. It's one thing if there's only one animal available, so then we assume if it's the only animal that you're shechting, of course I'll use that. But if two animals are available to him, shouldn't we have to consult with him which one he prefers and use that one for the Korban Pesach? Why is it okay to just take the first one? Maybe he prefers the other one. So the Gemara answers, Masnisim b'melech u'malka. Our Mishnah is talking about a king and a queen. A king and a queen completely rely on their staff to choose their menu for them. It's like when you come home, you don't ask questions, right? Your wife cooks for you because you're the king of the house, right? This is going to be on tape. Anyway, but no, the point is that a king and a queen don't tell their staff what to make. They completely rely on it, and because they're so opulent and wealthy, they don't give it a second thought. Whatever the chef decides to cook for that night, we'll be happy to eat. And therefore, when a king and a queen go over to their Eved and say, "Do us a favor and shech the Korban Pesach," they don't care. So even if the Eved brings back two animals, it's not like you say, "Oh, I wish I really, because it's such an expense, I want to take one animal over the other for my." They don't care. It doesn't make a difference to them. Shecht 100 animals. We don't care. So therefore, whatever they shechted first, we assume is fine with them, and that's going to be the Korban Pesach. V'hatanya, and here's the brayso to indicate that. You can't hedge your bets and put yourself put yourself on the list for two different animals. However, but there was once an incident where the king and the queen told their servants, "Shech the Korban Pesach for us." And because they wanted to hedge their bets, they shechted two different animals, a sheep and a goat. So they went and asked the king, so which one should we use for the Korban Pesach? He says, I don't know the halacha, go ask the queen. She's right. Well, he knows who's the boss, but Rashi says he knew that the queen was wiser than he. So I'm not sure whether this was at the times of Yanai. I don't know who the king was in here. It could have been Yanai, and his wife we know was the sister of Shimon ben Shetach. She was a very wise woman. So maybe that's what was going on over here. I'm not sure. Bo v'shalom min amalka amr lahem l'chu v'shalus Rabbi Gamliel. So they asked the queen. She said, I don't know either. Go ask Rabbi Gamliel. This must be Rabbi Gamliel Hazaken, the first Rabbi Gamliel, not the standard Rabbi Gamliel, who was alive in the times of Yavne after the Churban, but this is the elder Rabbi Gamliel, the grandfather of the famous Rabbi Gamliel, right, who was alive during the Bayit Sheni. So Bo v'shalas Rabbi Gamliel. So they went and asked Rabbi Gamliel and Amar Lahem, Malka umelech the Daitan Kalalei and Yochlu Min Rishon. So he said to them, look, he says, the king and the queen, you can shecht and slaughter as many animals as you want. They don't really care. It doesn't make a difference to them. And therefore, whatever you shechted first is fine with them. And that's what they assume is wanted for the Korban Pesach. But Anan lo nocha lo min harishon v'lo min hasheni. But we, if something was done like that for me, since I would never have authorized shechting two animals, I would have only authorized the shechting of one animal for my household. I can't eat the first one or the second one because you're not allowed to hedge your bets on the Korban Pesach. And therefore, since they hedge their bets for me, both of them are not okay. That you sort of basically they negate each other. Here's another story. Once they found a lizard, looked like it was a dead lizard in the kitchen in one of the pots. Ubikshu l'tame kol ha'seuda kula. So they wanted to make the entire seuda tame, because the lizard must have invariably crawled all over the place. So bo v'shalu es hamelech amalem lechu v'shalu es hamalka. So they went and asked the king, is everything tame? So he said, I don't know, ask the queen. Bo v'shalu es hamalka amarhem lechu v'shalu es Rabbi Gamliel. They asked the queen, she said, I don't know, go ask Rabbi Gamliel. Bo v'shalu osa amar lahem beis mita amit b'chaim roseach otzonin. So Rabbi Gamliel says, let me ask you something. Was the where you found the lizard, was it a hot food? Was it in a pot with hot stuff, or was it in a cold pot? So Amr lo roseach. They said we found the dead lizard in a hot pot. So Amr lahem lechu v'hatil oleha kol shel tzonei. So Rabbi Gamliel says, go take a cup of cold water, pour it over the lizard, which appears to you to be dead. Halchu v'hitil oleha kol shel tzonin v'richasha. They poured cold water over the lizard, and it turned out that the lizard wasn't dead yet. It was still, the cold water revived it, and it was still moving. And we know that a sheretz only conveys tumah upon its death. So he was basically able to demonstrate that this lizard did not convey any tumah because it was still alive. V'tir Rabbi Gamliel kol hasuda kula. Nimsa melech toli b'malka, v'nimsa malka tuli Rabbi Gamliel, nimsa kol hasuda tuli Rabbi Gamliel. So it turns out the king was dependent on his wife for psak halacha. The queen was dependent upon the Rav for the Psak Halacha, and therefore the whole Suda, you have to thank the Rav for being able to eat at your house. And I'll take all the credit. Okay. Anyway, Shachach ma sharma lo Rabo, if the Eved forgets what the master told him to do, so then he can make a Tanai and say, look, I'm going to shecht 2 animals, and whatever, if my master said the lamb will be for him, and the goat will be for me, and vice versa. So the Gemara says, Shali? Mashikana Ebed Kana Rabo. How can he say that the remaining animal will be for me? Anything that the Ebed acquires is automatically belongs to his master, so how can he hold back ownership of an animal for himself? That's precisely why he's completely dependent upon his master's table. He doesn't have any of his own independent assets. So Amar Rabbi Holo Chetzel Roa Harogel Rabo Etzlo Denichale B'Takanta de Rabbe. The answer is that there is one way for an Eved to be kona something. If an Eved walks along the street and picks up something, so we know whatever he picks up, and he's kona, he automatically is kona for his master. Is there any way for an Eved to independently be kona something for himself? Yes, if you have an added ingredient, which is the das of the makna, which is the person who is giving it to him or making the kinyan with the Eved, so the Eved should be kona, specifically has in mind that I only want you, the Eved, to be kona, and I don't want your master to be kona. In that situation, it is possible for the Eved to be kona independently of his master. So here's what happens. The Eved goes to the shepherd. He says, "Oi, my friend the shepherd, you know my master. You're good friends with him, right?" He says, "Yeah, of course." He says, "I got a big dilemma. I don't know what he told me. I don't remember whether he wanted a sheep or whether he wanted a goat. So I need you to do me a favor. Give me both animals." And the shepherd says, "Okay, fine. But what I'll do is, I'll make a tanai with you. If your master wants the sheep, you're kind of the sheep for your master. And if he doesn't want the sheep, then you're kind of it only for yourself and not for your master. And because you have das makna added in this ingredient, in this whole scenario, it is possible for the Eved to be koined independently, and only under those conditions could the Eved actually remove himself from the chabur of his master and have the korban pesach for himself. Okay, let us go weiter. So shachach rabo masha amrlo v'chulei. Now, if both of them forget, both the Eved and the master forget, so what's the halacha? They're both yotzei korban pesach, but they have to burn both animals, and they do not have to bring pesach sheni. Amar Rabbi lo shanu elo sheshachach achar zrika de beidna de izrik dam havachazi laachila. Aval shachach lifnei zrika de chi izrik dam lo havachazi laachila chayav alasos pesach sheni. So Abaye qualifies this halacha severely. He says that halacha, that they were both yotzei, the korban pesach, is only true when the master forgot which animal he preferred after the zrika sadam. Because as long as he remembered, as long as he knew which animal he wanted at the time of Zrika Saddam, we say that the Zrika was done over an edible animal, over an animal where, in theory, if we cooked it right then at the time of Zrika, the master could eat it because he knew exactly which animal he wanted. But if at the time of the Zrika, already by then, the master had forgotten, then this animal is not edible because we don't know who it's for. We don't know whether it's for the master or for the slave, and since we don't know, it's not considered to be edible, and therefore the Zrika is done on a non-edible Korban Pesach, it doesn't count. The Zrika is only kosher if the carcass that the Zrika is being done for is an edible, eatable animal. And since the animal is not eatable, then the Korban Pesach is not kosher, and then both of them, both the Eved and the Rav, will have to bring Pesach Sheni because they weren't Yotzei Pesach Rishon. Ika Damasin La Abraisa. Some say that this statement of Abaye was not stated on our Mishnah, but was rather stated on the following Braisa. Chamisha Shenis Arvu Oros Pischeim Zebazeh. You have 5 guys who have each one has his own Korban Pesach, and they're all around. They're all in the same vicinity, and they've carried home their carcasses with the hides also. And the hides somehow get mixed up with each other, and they don't mind because they're all friends, and they figure, okay, we'll all take home a hide at the end of the day. So what happens is v'nimtzeis yabeles be'echad mehen. The problem is that a lesion is found on one of the hides, and a lesion is considered a mum, which means that the animal with the yabeles was not a kosher Korban Pesach. So one of these guys was not yotzei the Korban Pesach. So kulan yotzin lebeis hasreifa upetur milasus pesach sheni. They are all of the carcasses have to be burned because since one of them is not a kosher korban, you can't eat it. They all have to be burned misafek, but at the same time they're all yotzei Korban Pesach and they don't have to bring a Pesach Sheni. Which the question is why? Why are they all yotzei? So Amar now. When we say that they're yotzei, I think I misspoke. It's not we know for sure that they were yotzei, but they don't bring a Pesach Sheni. They don't bring a Pesach Sheni. They can't. So the Gemara will explain that momentarily. So Amar Abaye lo shanu elo shenis arvu la'achar zrika de beidna de izdarek dam miha havachazi la'achila avol nis arvu lifnei zrika chayav lasos Pesach Sheni. So that on that Abaye says that's only true if the pelts got mixed up after the Zrika. But if the pelts got mixed up before the Zrika, then at the time of Zrika, since you didn't know which animal was good and which animal wasn't good, the Zrika is being done over animals that are not really edible because you can't eat any of the animals. It's not a kosher Zrika, and therefore none of the 5 are yotzei the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, and they will all have to bring a Pesach Sheni. So man demasni amas nisin kol shekain abraisa. Now, if you learn that a biased statement was said on our Mishnah, which is the case of where we don't know which animal the master wanted, so then certainly it would apply to the Bryce as well, where one of the animals is a balmum. But man demasni abraisa aval ames nisan lo kaven de kasheira ninhu de idkar habichazi lachila kameshamaya galia. So if you learn that a biased statement was only stated on the Brisa, where one of the animals is a balmum, it's possible that only in that situation does Abaye say that if the pelts got mixed up before the Zrika, then none of the Korban Pesachs are kosher and they have to bring a Pesach Sheni. But in the case of our Mishnah, Abaye might not be that machmir. Why? Because in the case of the Brisa, one of these animals is definitely inherently not a good animal for Korban Pesach. But in the case of our Mishnah, both the goat and the sheep are perfectly kosher animals for the Korban Pesach. We just don't know which one the master wanted to be for his Korban Pesach. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows, and since HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows, and it's only something that's a chisaron, a deficiency in the mental attitude of the owner, maybe we're not going to be so machmir to say that you can't be yotzei Korban Pesach. Granted, it's not edible because we don't know which one he wanted, but really almost like quantum physics, because God is the observer and he knows which one the master wanted. Maybe that's sufficient to make it a kosher Zrika because the animal really is edible from God's vantage point. So Amar Mar. So let's go back for just a moment. Upeturn milasus Pesach Sheni. They're all going to be, the 5 are all going to be exempt from making a Pesach Sheni. Frek the Gemara. V'ha'ika chad lo nafik. One of them is certainly not going to be yotzei the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. So how can you tell me that they're all exempt from doing Pesach Sheni? The Gemara says you're right, but mishum de lo efsher. But you're right, one of them is not yotzei Korban Pesach, but we can't tell him to go ahead and do Pesach Sheni. Heichi li'avid. What is he supposed to do? Leisi kol chad v'chad Pesach. If we tell each one misafek, hey, we don't know whether it was your animal or not, so each one of you better bring a Pesach Sheni Korban. Kamaisi chulun lazara. De'arba minayu avdilahu. He says that's problematic. 4 of them were yotzei Pesach, so then 4 out of your 5 are going to be bringing an animal that's chulin to the Azara. Lesi kulu chad Pesach. Maybe that you should say, let's all five of us bring jointly one big animal, and we'll all be part of the chabura for Pesach Sheni. Nimsa Pesach nechal shelo lemenuya. But then how are we going to eat it? Because then it'll turn out that the four of us that already were Yotzei cannot be counted as part of a chabura, and therefore we can't sit down and partake of it. So none of them are going to be able to eat it, and you're back to square one. You're going to be shechting and doing the zrika over an animal that's not edible. So hi mai nesi chad minayu pischo v'nesni v'nema ididi bal mum hai da isi hashnu yavi pesach v'ididi tam hai da isi hashnu yavi shlamim. One other option, says the Gemara, is let them each take an animal and make a tanai and say like this: if my animal was the bal mum a month ago, so then this animal now will count as my Pesach Sheni. But if my animal was not the bal mum and it was a kosher, I was already yotzi the korban Pesach, so then I want this animal to be considered a shlamim. Why can't they do that? So the Gemara says, lo efshir. That also is going to be problematic. And we'll finish with this, even though we're going to continue this discussion. Mishum di'ika chazi v'shok de kohanim hu da achli lei. The answer is because you have a dilemma about what to do with the chazei v'shok. The chest and the thigh of a korban shlamim have to be given over to a kohen. You're not allowed to eat it yourself. You have to give it to the kohen. A korban pesach, the chest and the thigh are eaten by the owner. So you have a dilemma. You can't. Who's going to eat this chest and thigh? I have to. Do I give it to the kohen who's not part of my chabura, or in which case I'm violating the law that it can only be eaten by members of my chabura? But if I don't give it to the kohen, I'm not allowed to eat it if it's the kohen's chest and thigh. So you have the dilemma of what to do with that. So the Gemara is going to continue this discussion tomorrow about what kind of possible remedy we could make for someone who's not sure whether he's chayv in a Pesach Sheni or not. Have a wonderful day.